Hello, and thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime, the podcast where we discuss cybercrimes and cybersecurity news. This week we are not exactly going to be talking about any cybercrimes, but rather a law meant to prevent them from happening. The UK is proposing measures that would apply to the public sector and the owners and operators of critical national infrastructure. Critical national infrastructure refers to 13 different sectors in the UK, which is chemicals, civil, nuclear, communications, defense, emergency services, energy, finance, food, government, health, space, transportation, and water. The measurement in question that applies to all of these sectors is that they would not be allowed to make any ransomware payments anymore at all. This is to discourage ransomware threat actors from targeting those sectors, because if they legally cannot pay the ransom, and they refuse to violate this law, the threat actors hacking them get absolutely nothing in return, and all of that effort put into making malware, having someone infiltrate, was completely wasted. I have relatively mixed feelings about this proposal, mostly positive, but still mixed. In general, it is not best to pay a ransom, because, well, there's a chance that threat actors can leak whatever data they stole later, or even give incorrect or a partial amount of encryption keys. In other words, people hacking you, there's a good chance they may perhaps be dishonest people. On the other hand, ransomware threat actors do kind of have an incentive to be honest, because, well, if it turns out they're going to all of these organizations saying they'll delete their data and then they're just leaking it later, there's not going to be a ton of organizations willing to pay the ransom if it's going to end up the same way anyways. So, usually they do actually give you what they promise, though in many cases, such as ransomware groups that are going to be disbanding soon, they won't do this because they're going to be disbanding soon. So, many organizations do end up paying a ransom. And there's a very good reason for that, which is ransomware is nearly impossible to get rid of if you do not have functional backups of everything, or if you are not willing to rebuild everything from the ground up. Ransomware is malware that can infect entire systems or individual files, and essentially locks them using encryption. They can only be unlocked by a key that the threat actor has, and you can only get that key by paying the ransom to the ransomware actors. If you can't pay, you can't get anything that has been encrypted back. It's simple as that. So, you either have to hope that you have backups of your systems that have been tested, can be restored, and are good enough, and have not been infected as well, because if they are infected, well, the same thing's just going to happen again. And a lot of times ransomware actors do anticipate you have backups, and will not activate the ransomware right away. They'll wait until about when you think your backups happen, and make sure that those backups also are infected with it. And then it's after that point that they will decide to activate the ransomware. So, this is actually also not so uncommon to having your backups infected. You could also be willing to rebuild everything from the ground up and just accept your losses. Sometimes this is actually a pretty okay choice. I've seen organizations willing to do this, though it is going to be a lot of work and very, very expensive. Probably more expensive than it would be to just pay the ransom, which is, again, why people are willing to do it. This kind of leads into my biggest issue that I have with this. If a government organization in the UK is hit by ransomware and they're not allowed to pay, that data is just gone for good and is probably getting leaked on the internet. A common method ransomware actors use is called double extortion, which means not only is your data encrypted, but the threat actors also have a copy of it that they will threaten to leak online if they don't pay, which can lead to a nightmare for both the organization and, well, if it's a government sector, anyone living in the UK, really. On one hand, I do think this will prevent a lot of ransomware attacks on the public sector in the UK, which is the goal here. I agree that if generally there's less ransomware attacks against the public sector, there's going to be less downtime, there's going to be less data breaches, and threat actors are just going to be a lot less willing to target organizations that are not going to pay them. On the other hand, the fallout from if a ransomware group decides to do it anyways is going to be absolutely massive. If there's any type of group that absolutely does not mind taking major risks, it's ransomware groups. So, it's still going to happen for sure. It would be incredibly naive to think that this measure would simply stop ransomware altogether. And if one of these organizations is hit by ransomware, what's going to happen? Massive data breaches, incredibly expensive IT infrastructure rebuilds, and potentially lost data that's never going to be recovered again. I'm just wondering, is that trade-off going to be worth it? Maybe it is. Maybe this will decrease ransomware attacks enough that, yeah, a couple major data breaches are worth it if it's preventing hundreds of more data breaches. I can see that. Currently, this is not a law, but the UK public sector generally doesn't pay ransoms anyways, though there is a very broad exception policy that allows them to. Are we keeping those exceptions? Because if so, that doesn't really change a whole lot, including the discouragement of these threat actors to keep targeting the public sector. If they know that this organization, because it's healthcare, can easily get an exception, they're going to be about just as likely to target it anyways. I think this is a really interesting case, and if enacted into law, I would be incredibly interested to see statistically how this ends up going. If it reduces the amount of ransomware attacks, and by how much, how does it impact the number of data breaches? Will they go up because threat actors will leak the data without a payment? Or down because they'll stop targeting the public sector? Or up because they're just moving towards the private sector? How are exceptions going to be handled? Are there going to be no exceptions? That is potentially incredibly risky with this data on the line. What support is going to be provided after a ransomware attack to these organizations? And how much will the UK end up spending on rebuilds of environments versus ransom payments? It's all really fascinating to me to see just how this is going to end up balancing out. Thank you to Reuters, JumpSec, IT Brew, and of course gov.uk for information on this new measure and a couple of concerns I wanted to highlight, of course. And thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime. Tell me, what do you think is going to happen after this is implemented? Do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing? And what should we expect to see in the future? I'm really interested to hear the opinions of others on this topic, because I haven't really seen it talked about a whole ton. But anyways, until next time, stay secure.